team, welcome back to That's Helpful, the No BS Self-Improvement Club, backed by science. As many of you know, I am now a parent. I think that's the first time I said that thing out loud. The last few months have truly humbled me. Being a parent is hard. And with so much advice out there, it's very tricky to know what's best for your children or the kids in your life. So what is good for them? Well, Dr. Norman Swan has done the work for you from birth to 10 years old in his new book, So You Want to Know What's Good for Your Kids. If you're an Aussie, you'll know his name. He trained in pediatrics and he's also a dad, so he knows the struggle firsthand. We're going to talk through some of the biggest takeaways, everything from where our kids' temperament comes from, how to strike the right balance when it comes to discipline and what it means to be a good enough parent. Now, Dr. Norman Swan, as someone who has recently had a baby, as I said, I think she's 11 weeks old this week, so I'm in the trenches. Yeah, thank you so much. One thing I have been absolutely sideswiped by that I had no idea was an actual problem or even an issue to prepare yourself for is the fact that you get so much advice and so much differing advice, even from medical professionals. The fact that you go into the doctor's office and you feel like you've been spun round, blindfolded and sent back out again, and you have to try and figure out which is the way up. So I'm aware I'm asking somebody who's giving her advice how to figure out how to best take advice. But how do we decide, like, what is the best advice to us and what to disregard when it comes to this kind of medical advice for our kids?
Well, the simple answer is buy the book, but if you're not, but seriously, that is the hardest job of all, is sifting out what's right from wrong, bullshit from not bullshit, and and sometimes the doctors just don't know. Crying babies are a nightmare for parents, and they are for doctors as well. The research is poor in terms of why babies cry, so we call it colic. Is it colic? Is it sleeplessness? What is going on? So I cover crying quite a lot, as do with
I scoured that bit.
But you're right in the middle of that, I suspect, because when you look at the research, crying kind of hits around about 4 to 6 weeks. It lasts usually for 6 to 8 weeks and then seems to decline. So there's a period in the middle where you just get a lot of crying. And then there's all this advice. So doctors are over-prescribing medicines to reduce the acid in a baby's stomach, thinking it's acid reflux. The World Health Organization, the College of Pediatrics have all expressed concern about the amount of prescribing of these drugs. Yet sometimes parents say they swear by it. When they miss a dose, the crying starts again. We probably over-prescribing rice formulae and other formulae because thinking that the baby has an intolerance. And yet, I mean, I could go on and on, but the point here is that there is an evidence base. And what I do in the book is present you with that evidence base, and you can make up your own mind if it makes sense. Now, where your specific question about what do you know about how do you know what to do is a researcher at the University of Queensland who helped me, who I gave some parts of the book to read and researches sleep, smiled kind of benignly at me when I told her I was writing this book. And she said, "Oh, do you know what advice I give my parents when I see them in clinic is if you're going to buy a book on sleep," her area was sleep, ask yourself, is my child's name on the cover? In other words, Jason Smith's book on sleep. And if your child's name's not on the cover, you got to be really careful because every child is different and the solutions are different. And what you got to do, and it's the hardest job of the lot, take all that advice, say, well, what actually makes sense for my children? And that's why I have not written an advice book. I've written an evidence book. I present you with the evidence. I'm sorry, I can't be in your bedroom or in the kitchen. You've got to make up your own mind what you do with that.
Yeah, it is tricky. That is for sure. One of the best bits of advice that I got, and it's also the most frustrating bits of advice, is that you've just got to learn your baby, you know, in these early few days, and it can be really hard. But one of the brilliant bits that I read in the book,
pick you up on learn your baby?
What's that?
Can I just pick you up on that
Yeah,
comment?
please, go on.
It's a really important comment. So this book is
Yeah.
about children not to 10 years old. So it's from birth to 10.
Yeah.
And I do that deliberately because most books on childhood end at age 4 or 5, maybe even younger than that, age 2, and then they start again in adolescence, you know, the nightmare of adolescence. And the thought here is that those years of 5 to 10 are the salad years where you can just sit back and relax before the dark clouds of adolescence descend over your family. But what I'm doing is trying to give you the evidence as to how you set yourself up for a parenting for life. Because when you're 90 years old and your child is 70, you will still be that child's mum or dad. And they will look to you to be their mum and dad. They might want to mother you or parent you because they think you're old and decrepit, but they still look to you as their parent. And it's how you set it up. So coming back to this point you made earlier, which is fundamental to how you are as a parent throughout those first 10 years of life, and indeed the rest of the child's life, is this concept that I use in the book, which is that parenting is a game of tennis.
Yeah, this is really interesting.
And it's about serve and return. And child psychologists talk about this. And getting to know your baby is about serve and return. And when I was training in pediatrics, I was taught not just to listen to the heart of a newborn baby or check the hips and feel the tummy and so on. I was taught to assess the child behaviorally. And that involved, you can actually have a conversation with a newborn baby. Now, you know this now because you've just been through
I
it.
do.
And you talk to the baby, you throw the baby around a little bit. Not quite throw the baby around, but you play with the child physically. You look at the child in the eye. You serve to the baby. And even a newborn baby will return. And then depending on that return, you modify your stroke back to the baby. So some babies are placid and are cool about other people around. Some babies are reactive and they don't like new things. It's not a problem. That's just their temperament. And you learn. So if I serve too hard to a newborn baby and they react and don't like it, then my return stroke is very soft and gentle. Whereas if they're really placid, I'll try and push them, see how far I can get with them. And that is true for the rest of your life, is that you will find that your game of tennis varies according to your child. So when you have your next child, you'll think that you've learned everything you need to know from this first one, and then this next one, you'll say, is an individual, and you've got to learn all over again. But there are some basic rules.
Stop it. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I found really reassuring in the book is that, in fact, you talk about the fact that when the babies are crying, you don't actually see when healthy babies are crying, you don't actually see any changes in their cortisol, in their stress hormones, right?
Correct. And so crying is something that you don't need to be too distressed about. That doesn't mean to say you ignore it. That doesn't mean to say you don't check in on the child. That doesn't mean to say you don't meet the child's needs about changing the nappy, of feeding, or what have you. There's always a reason for crying. Yeah. But the crying is the child as you say, in a healthy baby where there's nothing going wrong and they're comfortable. You can't find any reason for the crying. You know, they're asking for something, maybe just food or what have you. But if you've got to train a child into sleep, and you go through the extended period training where you go in, settle them, pat them, go out, and each time you go out for longer and longer, you can be fairly reassured that you're not damaging your child's psyche for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, thank God, because, you know, we're so early on in this journey, but me and my husband, when she first started crying, oh my gosh, it sent us into a spin and we were panicking. It's like, what do we do? What's wrong? And we're kind of getting better at it now. But when I read that, I found that very reassuring. And it did help me to see. And, this is advice that my mum's been telling me all along, oh, babies cry, she's fine. She's absolutely fine. But learning that little tidbit has been incredibly helpful. And so in terms of things that we can control, because as you go into in the book, a lot of a child's health is often determined by the situation that they're born into, considering race and, socioeconomic groups and that kind of thing. That's hugely indicative of a child's health. But in terms of the things that we can control, how important is the pregnancy to your child's health? Because there's a lot of emphasis placed on this. And as someone who's just been through it, you feel the weight of the world on your shoulders when you are pregnant, and anything you do is scrutinized and criticized, and people have all eyes on you and you have all eyes on yourself. But how important is pregnancy really to your child's life?
It's really important at the extreme. So it used to be thought, researchers have argued that the most important part of a child's life is in fact pregnancy. Yeah. And the outcome of pregnancy determines the rest of that child's life. And it's simply not true. And it's research that really didn't look at all the variables. So there's no question that if a mother goes through extreme deprivation in pregnancy, particularly physical deprivation, then that will affect the child's health for the rest of that child's life. What some researchers have argued is that it will also affect that child's children, because you get changes in the genes called epigenetic changes, where the genes change shape and their action, and that can be transmitted beyond generations. In fact, there's little or no evidence to support that. But there's no question that extreme deprivation can change the life of the unborn baby. But for the average pregnancy, and indeed the average person, even with self-deprivation, what happens after pregnancy is far more important. That's what has the impact. And I tell 3 stories in the book on exactly this topic. The 3 stories the first of the 3 stories is called the Hunger Winter. So the Hunger Winter. This is the only time in human history, one of the few times in human history, where there's been a famine, hunger, where you know the start date and you know the stop date. And it was in the Netherlands in 1944. And the Allies were coming up through Normandy, through Belgium, and they got stuck on the Rhine. And the Germans reacted viciously. It was occupied territory. And they cut off food to the population, particularly of Amsterdam. And they went through essentially a famine in a very cold winter from about October of 44, thereabouts, to about April, May 45. Start date and stop date. This was sounds cruel to say, but an ideal experiment. 20,000 people died. It was incredibly traumatic. And they have studied women who were pregnant before the Hunger Winter, women who were pregnant during the Hunger Winter, and women who were pregnant after. And there's no question that women who were pregnant during the Hunger Winter had babies who ended up getting more coronary heart disease, more diabetes, tended to be fatter, more cognitive decline, and probably lived shorter lives. But there's no evidence that that was transmitted beyond that generation. The second story I tell, I won't go into all the stories, but I tell another story which is called The Midwife, which is actually the true story behind that series on British television that we've seen here, about a midwife at the turn of the 19th, 20th century who got an army of midwives together to help children get through that first year of life, and did improve health and well-being. And the third story is the data from Australian recruitment into the army through the Boer War, the First World War, and the Second World War, which shows that the experience of women in pregnancy was very important to these kids' health and well-being, but it didn't go beyond that generation. And there were kids who did well. So what happens with the average pregnancy is what happens afterwards is far more important.
Really interesting and kind of very the opposite of what I've heard, particularly during my pregnancy. And as you say, it's not to say that you shouldn't take care of yourself, but it takes the pressure off somewhat, which sometimes I think adds to some of an already stressful time.
Yeah, I mean, it's not licensed to smoke 36
No.
a day, or go bungee jumping, but nonetheless, for the average person leading a sensible life.
Yeah, you're good. Yeah, absolutely. And so, what does the science say? Because this is another thing that there is an enormous pressure faced by mothers around is breastfeeding. What does the evidence say about breastfeeding and to what extent we should be prioritizing it? Because having been on this journey myself, there is a lot of pressure. If you can't breastfeed or if you have troubles or if you have challenges while you're breastfeeding, the implication is that as long as you're hanging on by a thread and you can continue breastfeeding, you absolutely should be, when in actual fact, it's incredibly hard and stressful. And having had mastitis multiple times in the last few weeks, it's not pleasant. So I'm really interested to hear how actually, important breastfeeding and the length in which we breastfeed is for our children.
You've got to differentiate a rich, healthy country like Australia, for most of its citizens, not all, but most of its citizens, from a low-income country where you can't even guarantee the cleanliness of the water and the hygiene of the water. So if you're bringing up a baby in a low-income country where you can't afford contraceptives or they're not there available, you can't assure that you've got clean water to make up formula, there is absolutely no question that breastfeeding is the best thing to do for your baby for as long as you're able to do that. The circumstances, and there's lots of benefits from breastfeeding, there's no question about that. But the thinking has changed over the last few years from breast is best to fed is best. Mm-hmm. And so you have babies who are crying a lot, who are hungry, who are not settling down to sleep at night because they haven't got a full tummy. The babies who cry a lot in that period where you're just you're just coming through that now. Yeah. The babies who are breastfed cry more than formula. Now, I'm not arguing for formula-fed babies. My kids were all breastfed for a long time. It's the best thing for them. But breastfed babies seem to cry more during that time. And it may well be a problem with the microbiome in the bowel, where they lack some bugs which help to break down the breast milk. And therefore, when they drink the breast milk, they get sore tummies because they've got undigested milk in their intestines. And there are probiotics that may be able to help that. It may be a rest with other formulae may help that. Or it may be stopping breastfeeding altogether, which is not a disaster in a modern, hygienic country like Australia. You'd have a very different conversation if it was in a low-income country. But fed is best is really what we should be focusing on, and I talk a lot in the book. So the breastfeeding community may not like some of the things I've said, but there's just a pragmatic element. The longer you can go, the better. And if you're able to breastfeed for at least a while, that's terrific. But if you have to change, you have to change. The baby needs to be fed.
Yeah. And in terms of introducing food a little bit earlier than we would have thought, you go into this in the book, but it's actually can be better in terms of allergies in children, not staving off too long to introduce solid food into babies' diets, right?
Well, this comes back to this story about the World Health Organization and breastfeeding. So the World Health Organization's advice is very focused, quite rightly, on low-income and middle-income countries, not so much countries like Australia. So they don't want to risk breastfeeding because they know that's the most hygienic, safest way to bring up a baby in a low hygiene community. However, the evidence suggests that that's actually quite strong. Now, what happened is that pediatricians don't like contradicting the World Health Organization. But in fact, it's not the best advice to say no solids at all till after 6 months in the Australian context. In fact, it's not even followed that closely in the developing country, low-income country context. And pediatricians have probably caused the epidemic, in part, of peanut allergy and other food allergies. Because the earlier within limits, we'll come to what the limits are in a minute, the earlier you introduce solids, the more likely you are to have those solids getting into the baby when their immune system still has trainer wheels on. And you can train the immune system. And they've done interesting studies where they've compared kids with the same genetic stock. One study was Israeli Jewish kids living in Israel and Jewish kids in London. So same kind of genetic stock. Kids in London got peanut allergy. Kids in Israel didn't. Sweeping generalization. You do get peanut allergy in Israel, and so on, but less likely. What's the difference? In Israel, they introduced solids earlier, and those solids contain peanut. So you're exposing the child. Whereas after 6 months, the immune system has closed some doors to that ability to become trained. Now, there probably is a limit. You probably don't want to introduce solids before 4 months. There's some evidence to suggest that might be associated with becoming overweight. But after 4 months, and it's also not one size fits all. You've got to have a baby who's interested in taking solids. They've usually got to have pretty good head control. They've got you're able to swallow and so on. So not every child at 4 months is ready to take solids, just in that neurodevelopmental sense. But when they are, then introducing a wide variety of foods to the baby over a period of time does reduce the incidence of food allergy. The other thing that reduces the incidence of allergy, more like asthma, hay fever, and eczema, is growing up in your first year of life with pets.
Brilliant, yeah.
And it's the same thing about training the immune system. And the more pets, the better. So it doesn't matter whether it's cats or dogs or what have you. And they talk about replicating the farmyard at home, because kids who grow up on a farm are far less likely to have asthma, hay fever, and eczema than kids growing up in the city. And it's this same training of the immune system. And here's the paradox, and it's why some allergists disagree with this advice, is that when you skin test kids when they're 3 who've grown up with pets in the first year of life, they come up skin test positive for cat, dog, what have you, but they actually don't have symptoms.
Yeah, right.
So, anyway, I've gone a long answer to a short question, but it comes back to what you said right at the beginning, is you get advice even from doctors, and sometimes that advice is not based on solid evidence.
Yes, which I am absolutely experiencing. It's tricky. And I think I've learned a real lesson in be careful going looking for a solution to a problem that's not really there, right? So, with the crying babies thing, well, babies cry, but then you can go and you can get focused on it and over-focused on certain things and take them to a doctor who thinks you want an answer, and they'll find an answer. And that whole rigmarole has definitely been a lesson for me. Absolutely. And so this was really fascinating in terms of the neural developmental stages of a baby and of children. But where does our temperament come from? I guess this ties into the crying and how far you can push the serve and return.
Yeah. So in context in the book, I'm remembering the book's between 0 and 10 years of age. So you capture those salad years, because a lot goes on in those years. It's the runway to adolescence, and a lot changes. Is that, and I talk about genes, and genes do determine temperament to a significant extent. But I talk about genes as the canvas of life, but we paint on that canvas. So the painting that is on top of that canvas, we make, the environment make, their friends make, schools make, and so on. And so if you think of life that way in terms of genes versus environment, is that we have enormous capacity to change how those genes are in the world and how that painting looks. But underneath it is always the same canvas. And one of the canvases and fundamental canvases is our temperament. Now, temperament is not pathological. Temperament is just the way we are in the world. And academics have made careers out of defining temperament into 30 different categories and what have you. But it boils down to really one. The most important thing is just one thing in terms of temperament that has been well researched, and that's something called reactivity. How reactive is your child? Now, anybody listening to our conversation who's got more than one child or has grown up in a family with siblings knows that everybody's good. You've got different temperaments, and you can go back, to your brothers and sisters, and when you're a parent of more than one child, you can say, well, that child was this way and is still that way 25, 30, 40 years later. And when you're 90 years old as a parent and 70, you're going to be able to see that original temperament. But it does change, and it does still have this element of canvas. So this reactivity that I'm talking about is really how reactive you are to the world around you. So, and it's there from birth, and you certainly see it very clearly from 3 or 4 months of age. And highly reactive babies, they don't like strange situations. They don't like strangers. They like what they can recognize around them. They don't like new circumstances, and get very upset and agitated when confronted with those situations. The other end of the reactive scale is a baby, child, adult who's pretty laid back, very social, quite likes experimenting with new things, likes getting out there and mixing it. And the reactive child, when they're 5, 6, 7, 8, probably quite likes being in their bedroom by themselves, reading a book or playing with the toys by themselves, and they don't feel the need to go out. Whereas your child who's a bit more laid back is driving you nuts because they want to go out and play with their friends and they want to do all sorts of things, and they're happy to try new stuff. Now, the mistake that both researchers, to some extent, and parents make is thinking it's pathological. So I've got this reactive child who doesn't like new things, blah, blah, blah. They're going to get an anxiety disorder.
Yeah.
And that's not true. It's absolutely not true. Yeah, there's a slightly increased risk of anxiety disorder, but there's plenty of laid-back kids who get anxiety disorders. It's a different phenomenon scientifically from a mental health issue. Your way of being in the world is your way of being about world, and that is what counts. I mean, if you take anxiety disorders, which I cover a lot in the book, and eating disorders and ADHD and what have you, the reassuring thing for parents is, and this comes back to genes as well, because something like anxiety is genetic as well as being environmental. If you look at parents with anxiety disorders, 65% of parents with anxiety disorders do not have a child with anxiety disorder. So it's not inevitable that you transmit that. And there's an even lower correlation with a reactive child with a reactive temperament in developing an anxiety disorder. Yeah, if you look at all children with anxiety disorders, more of them have had a reactive temperament than not, but it's not necessarily cause and effect.
Fascinating, really interesting, because I think there is this idea, like, especially when I was growing up, this idea that you had to be kind of pushed out of your comfort zone, and that would make you more of a resilient person, or if you're allowed to just do the things that you're comfortable with, then you wouldn't be able to bounce back in life later on. And my mum absolutely did not take that view, so I wasn't forced into doing anything that my disposition didn't actually enjoy. And yet, of course, my elder brother enjoyed different things, and I really think that's important, that that your temperament, you should be allowed to be just who you are, right? I really like that, and I think it's interesting.
Yeah, there is, like all these things, it can get complicated because what you've described there is your mother tailoring her parenting.
Yeah, this is interesting too.
Child's individuality, the serve and return. And what parents recognize also is that your child changes you.
Yeah.
So you've already been changed by your baby, and that will, and that will continue. But when you get your next child, if you have another one, that child will change you in a different way, and you parent each child differently. And what your mother was doing was tailoring the parenting to each child, which is the right thing to do. But there's a different, so when I talk about parenting, I talk about it on a couple of scales. And you can't talk about these scales separately. But one scale, imagine a line and where you fit on this line as a parent, from warmth to cold. So the cold parent is somebody who's pretty unemotional, doesn't give back much. And the warm parent is the one who's sort of loving, hugging, touchy-feely, all over the child, expressing love all the time. But you have to overlay on top of that discipline and setting limits. So if you are cold, but when you discipline and set limits for your child, they're reasonable and not, they're not harsh. They're just, you kind of got that, but you're not good at emotion. That child doesn't do too badly in life. It's not great, but it's not ideal. But if you're cold and harsh, and you're a disciplinarian, and you've got discipline for the sake of it, and trivial, that harsh cold parenting is very bad for a child's outcome. Tends to be a child that just doesn't do well, has anxiety disorders, drug and alcohol use problems later in life. So let's come to the other end of the scale, which is warmth. So remember, the cold parent, who's not very emotional, can actually be a pretty good parent in the middle with, because they're setting limits that are reasonable and the child recognizes that. Come to the other end, warmth. Everybody recognizes warmth is a good thing to have, being loving and what have you. But if you're warmth without discipline, in other words, you say to yourself, I want my child to learn about life by themselves. They'll work out their own limits and so on. I'm not going to get in the way, and I want my child to be happy all the time. That's called permissive or indulgent parenting. Warmth plus indulgence or permissiveness also has poor outcomes in the child. But that child tends to be the child who feel, as an adult, entitled, a high sense of entitlement. That tends to be the child, as an adult, who, when they start a new job, knows much more than anybody else in the workplace what needs to be done, because they're all idiots after a week or two. That tends to be the child who doesn't complete degrees at university and tries all sorts of different things. So the happy balance, which is a sweeping generalization and doesn't work for every hour of the day, especially 5 o'clock in the afternoon, is warmth with limits and boundaries. So I love you, and I love you unconditionally, but you have to know that's unacceptable. This is acceptable. It's also where you set up expectations. So we tend to have run away from the idea that parents should set expectations of their children. It's going to turn them into a neurotic wreck. It's about reasonable expectations, achievable expectations, but anxiety levels are lower in children where parents have set expectations, saying, I know you can do better at school than this. Let's work out, you can, you're not serving yourself very well. This is like a 7 or 8 year old. You could be doing better at maths than this. It's not that I want you to be a nuclear scientist or whatever. It's appropriate, developmentally appropriate expectations. And it's true of teachers as well. You don't want a teacher teaching your kids who's got low expectations of your child. You want a teacher who's got high expectations and works hard to achieve each child's potential. And so it's that setting of limits and boundaries within that warm environment that's caring and loving that is the sweet spot in parenting. But a lot of parents, probably every parent, wants to be the perfect parent.
Yes.
And there are huge risks in wanting to be the perfect parent. What is perfect parenting? I've just described something that's kind of on average and a bit messy. And it varies according to time of day. When you're tired and hungry, you're not the perfect authoritative parent. It all falls apart.
No.
And it increasingly falls apart as the child gets older. So I talk about the concept, and also you can tend to become overprotective, which is bad for your child, or the helicopter parent. I talk a lot about that in the book. It sounds as if I'm blaming parents for everything. I'm not. I'm just saying, if you're struggling for your style, here's the sort of styles you should head for rather than avoid. And I spend a lot of time in the book talking about being a good enough parent.
Yes.
You should not aim for being the perfect parent. You should aim to be a good enough parent, because that's far lower risk. And it accepts the fact that you're going to have good days and bad days. Your child's going to have good days and bad days. There are going to be days where you think, I wish I hadn't said that. That was not good. But life goes on and your child's not going to change. I mean, if you were to behave inappropriately every day of the week, that would be bad. But on a day where you're absolutely exhausted and your 8-year-old has pushed you to the limit, and you let fly verbally, well, so be it. Move on.
Yeah, you're human. Yeah, absolutely. I really like that idea of the good enough parent. And I think it's incredibly reassuring. Out of all of this, looking back, with your own kids and looking at the research, are there any things that stand out that you think, oh, I wish I'd known that?
Remember, I trained in pediatrics. I thought I knew it all, but
you knew a lot. You're the dangerous one.
Yeah. Well, look, and my kid's mother is a proper pediatrician. I never finished my pediatrics. She was a proper pediatrician, and she did the heavy lifting. Was a very good mother. Like any parent, I wish I was around. I now wish I'd been around more than. That's a common story. And now you've got two working parents in most families, and they both wish they'd been around. So the guilt hits. I think that I grew up in a household that wasn't very happy. I grew up with a mother who probably had borderline personality trait, which means that you could never trust her emotional reaction to you. Everything could be going swimmingly, superficially, everything's great, warm and attentive, and then turning on a sixpence, becoming angry and abusive and what have you. And as a child, that was very bad. And I recognized that, and I worked hard not to be like my mother, particularly, or my father. And I was lucky that attempt to kind of do the opposite, even though at times I could hear my mother's voice coming out of my mouth, kind of worked. And so I was lucky. I was lucky there. I think I'm not complacent about the way I parented, but I think I was reassured when I got down to the research that most of the time we kind of got it right. And for most parents, most of the time they do get it right.
Yeah. And that's the reassuring thing. And I also think if you're, picking up a book like this, or you're listening to a podcast like this, where you're striving to do the best thing, you're probably on the right track, most of the time, if you have that intention right.
I mean, there are things that are counterintuitive, and there are things that are tough. And, and when things go wrong or not going as well as you hoped, such as with ADHD or autism spectrum disorder or anxiety disorders and depression and eating disorders in particular, I cover that in a lot of detail, because what you think you should do is not necessarily what you should do. Do you recognize these problems? You need a lot of, when you need help, and you've got to call in help. And what I try and do in the book is, and also feeding, how your attitude towards food, fights over food, going through into those 5 to 10 year age groups, how you deal with food is, some of the things are not necessarily what you think you should do.
Yeah, right. Like what? Go on, give us an example.
Well, like your approach to unhealthy food.
Yeah,
if you're obsessed with your child eating unhealthily, your child's more likely to eat unhealthily.
Yeah, right.
And if you're overly restrictive on unhealthy food, your child may well end up fatter and eat more unhealthy food. Also, the risks of overprotective parenting, where you try and do too much for the child the child doesn't learn self-regulation and doesn't necessarily learn how, you don't learn from the child how to recognize that when they say they're full, they are full.
Yeah.
Even though you don't think they've eaten enough. So food is a very complicated area where you can get into tiger country. And I walk the reader through food right through those 10 years, because there are big issues and the things that you could do where you think you're doing the right thing and actually may not be the right thing.
Very, very interesting. Out of all of this, you cover a lot of ground in the book, 0 to 10 years. There's a lot in there. What's the biggest piece of advice you want parents to know?
Be consistent, be predictable, make sure you've got routines and you apply those routines. If you are somebody who tends to chaos in their life, fight that tendency to chaos. Interestingly, if you grow up, if you parent in a chaotic household, which is a mess all the time, your parenting is going to be more chaotic. And if you just do the simple act of tidying the house, your parenting improves. And the other advice is you got to be match fit as a parent. And there are lots of things which reduce your match fitness, which are inevitable, like you've got at the moment, not getting a night's sleep and you're exhausted during the day.
How can you tell?
You're looking remarkably good on it. I'm just guessing. Just guessing here. But if you have, say, an anxiety disorder or depression, you're psychologically distressed yourself as a parent, you need to get that sorted out, because you're not going to be match fit as a parent if you've got your own issues going. So you've got to try and deal with those so that you can be the best parent you can be in that good enough sense. But if you're crippled by anxiety and depression, good enough might not be good enough in that situation. You've really got to try and help yourself through that. And the other is that when you're co-parenting, not everybody does co-parent, but if you're co-parenting, whether it's in the same household or in separated households, you kind of, for the sake of the kids, got to get your act together so that it's consistent. And it's a source of conflict where in heterosexual couples, it's often typified as the mother is good at imposing discipline and routine and consistency, and the father wants to indulge the child. And what is it? What's the harm in them going to bed at 10 o'clock at night rather than why do you force me to get home at 7 o'clock? And you have this conflict. You got to actually harmonize there for the sake of the child. When the child's a bit older, you can always take them out one night a week and have a blast. But you're not necessarily being the best parent you can be by breaking routines.
Yeah, fascinating. And just before you go, Norman, why the cleaning the house thing, why is cleaning the house immediately going to make you a better parent if you tend towards chaos?
Nobody knows the answer to that, but it probably is just simply your life becomes decluttered.
A little bit more order.
More ordered, yeah.
Because I'm a big believer in that. Interesting. This has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for sparing me the time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Brilliant. Dr. Norman Swan, you know him if you're an Aussie. He trained in pediatrics and he's also a dad, so he knows all this firsthand. His new book is called So You Want to Know What's Good for Your Kids. I'm going to put a link in the show notes and where you can find more of Dr. Norman Swan's work in there too. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. I'm Ed Stott and I sincerely hope that's helpful.